you've been watching my videos for a while, you'll know that Chord's Hugo TT2 has been a feature of my desk for some time, as well as featured in many of my videos as my primary digital to analog converter for evaluating amplifiers and headphones. So what is the Hugo TT2 and why is it special from other headphone amplifiers and digital to analog converters? The original Hugo TT was basically the original Hugo 1 in a box with some extra stuff added to give it a higher power output and a better power supply and some other features. But in the case of the TT2, it is an entirely unique component, and it sits between the Hugo 2 and the Dave in terms of both what it can do, and in some cases it has features that neither the Hugo 2 nor the Dave have, such as XLR outputs that are powerful enough to drive sensitive speakers and are suitable even for driving demanding headphones like Hi-Fi Man's Susvaras. So in today's video, I'm going to go through some of the technological details of the Hugo TT2, give an overview of its features, and then talk about my impressions, how it compares sound-wise, both in the amplifier section and the digital section, using it as a DAC to other headphone amplifiers such as the Studio 6 that I have below me, as well as other equipment. And I'll also talk about my impressions of how it sounds versus the Hugo 2 and the Dave, which I had in for review before, as well as the effect that the MScaler sitting below it has on the sound. And after that, I will be giving an MScaler review in a separate video, for which will be, in a sense, part 2 of my Chord Dave review. Probably one of the most remarkable things about something like the TT2 is versus other high-end DACs such as Schiit Audio's Yggdrasil, which is one of very well known in the headphone or headphi community, and say some of the Audio GD components which I have had in for review, is that they are very physically large. It seems that for better digital to analog conversion, you also need better power supplies and a bigger design. I mean, some of these DACs are literally mostly power supply. You also need a lot of complex components and other things. Part of that is the reasoning behind that is that the digital to analog converter chips themselves require a lot of sophisticated setup to get the best out of them. Not only do you have to have a digital to analog converter chip, but you also have to have some kind of amplification stage to give a high quality line out. And if you're also adding in a headphone amplifier, that adds yet another stage which the signal has to be passed through, which also has to be of very high quality. The unique thing about the Chord DACs is, of course, that they can do much better than average in a much smaller package. And the reason for this is that the digital to analog conversion is done in a WTA DAC, which is fed directly from an FPGA, which is programmed with custom code designed by Rob Watts, designed to provide the most accurate signal reproduction that he is able to achieve. And of course, as you get into the larger and more expensive components, the processing power and the actual digital to analog converter becomes larger. Because there are not multiple gain stages required to, say, for example, with a normal DAC chip, they have to filter out high frequency noise, and there are other issues alongside that, Rob Watts could actually focus on designing the most purely accurate DAC he was capable of doing. In the digital realm, he has accuracy down to minus 300 dBs for some low-level signals. So he intended that he was able to reproduce a signal that low. And one of the interesting discussions he's put online is that he has done his own blind tests, whereas differences in the noise floor modulation in his DACs down as far as minus 300 dB affected how well the sense of depth and the sound stage appeared to him. So even in changes which should technically make no audible difference, very, very, very far from any audible difference whatsoever, actually have an effect on the sound. And this is why Chord DACs are lauded for their amazing reproduction of soundstage depth. Because it does not use a conventional DAC setup, it can be very confusing for people who, say, ask in things with products such as the Hugo 2, or in this case the TT2, about whether the headphone output and the line output are the same. In the Hugo 2, of course, they are one and the same thing, and because in regular DACs people talk about having a dedicated line out or a headphone amplifier, those things don't need to be separate in a Chord DAC, and that's why we're alongside the much reduced requirements for power supplies, as 90% of what's going on is the main components are essentially an FPGA and this special DAC, the chord components can be relatively much simpler and much smaller. One of the unique features of the Chord TT2 is a power supply that includes supercapacitors. For those people who are not familiar, if you think of a battery as something that stores energy, it stores usually energy that is let out at a certain rate over a long period of time, versus a capacitor, which is designed to hold energy only for an extremely short period of time. So capacitors are used inside electronic components, say, to smooth the flow of electricity in components, similar to how if you have a water supply in a house, you might have a device for stopping that thump when you turn the water off. It's designed to absorb that. Likewise, in gas power supplies, they have them as well. But they're also used for isolating different parts of components, such as preventing raw DC current outputting to, say, a headphone amplifier, which could damage headphones, or for isolating different circuits, or sometimes because they have absorb at different frequencies and rates, they're often used for tuning devices to reduce high frequencies, because they can absorb high frequencies slightly and send out a signal which has maybe, say, a little bit of a roll off in the high frequencies. This was an unintended effect of, say, the original Chord Mojo, which had a capacitor coupled headphone output, and that it made it sound slightly warm as a result. And now that it has been removed from the Mojo 2, the sound has changed significantly. But in the case of a supercapacitor, it's somewhere between a battery and a capacitor. It's designed to hold charge for longer, maybe a few seconds rather than, say, minutes or hours. And in doing so, it can actually hold a large amount of current which can be used on demand by an electronic circuit. Now, if you think of musical signals are not just, say, a steady DC current, not just a steady signal, but a widely variable signal, which requires instant current demands for, say, driving speakers or headphones. So a large amount of capacitance is often used in headphone amplifiers to ensure that there's enough current available to drive headphones well. In the case of supercapacitors, they offer even more current than regular capacitors, and when you turn on a Chord TT2, it will actually spend a few seconds charging up. And this is probably one of the negatives I can get out of the way of the TT2, is that switching between headphone usage, which you get by plugging in a pair of headphones to the front, which cuts off the rear outputs, and unplugging it, there is something like about a 15-second changeover where you have to wait for the circuits to change over. Just as you do when you turn it on, it will say CHG for charge, and we're charging up the supercapacitors so that there is enough current available for the headphone circuit. So the headphone driving circuit is actually powerful enough than the TT2. It's the most powerful one that Chord have produced for their components. And probably one of my things I would wish for is something like a Chord Dave with the TT2's headphone driving ability. That would be really fantastic. To get better than that, you have to buy something like a T-Toby or similar, basically a power amp, which is what I plug the TT2 into for driving things like Hi-Fi Man Susvaras, although in my case, it's not a T-Toby, but an Audio GD power amp. The uniqueness of the TT2 doesn't just stop at the internal electronics by any means. The inputs are where things get very interesting. Now, it has a USB input which can accept up to 768K or DSD512, although Chord's DACs are optimized for PCM digital, although they can accept DSD. Because PCM digital audio is literally something like 99% of all audio out there, if not more, it makes sense to focus on optimizing that, although Rob Watts has done a lot of work to optimize the input of DSD so that it doesn't have that kind of very excessively rolled off transients that you get where the music sounds very blunted. Something I noticed a lot on some DACs that I've had in here, which either converted everything to DSD or had a DSD processing that made everything sound very vague and lacking in clarity. So it is possible, say, to use your own upsampling to the TT2, but generally the quality of the Watts transient aligned filter is going to be much higher quality than you can get in any kind of software, although the people, of course, will debate this online endlessly. But of inputs, we also have optical digital input, which has the benefit of isolation, although it can be hard to get higher than 96 kilohertz high res through it, because 192K is kind of pushing the limits of an optical cable, and a low quality one, or one that is not ideal, maybe too long, will not work particularly well with something like 192K music, but is very suitable if you have some kind of digital transport which does use optical, as it does provide full noise isolation. Lastly, probably the most interesting input are the BNC inputs, of which there are two. BNC, SPDIF digital inputs. Now there are no RCA based ones, so you have to ideally use a good quality 75 ohm digital cable for that. Very strangely, the MScaler came with two 50 ohm cables, which seemed to be a mistake by Chord, although with the optimized design of the TT2, it shouldn't make any difference. I ended up buying a couple of 15 centimeter basic digital cables off Amazon, which I've used successfully across all my gear with good results. I didn't go into buying any or getting any super high-end cables to try out. Other people can try that and go down that rabbit hole. I just stuck with something that was as simple as possible. But the fact that there are two BNC inputs means that both can accept a 384 kilohertz signal, basically very high res signal for each channel, and take that from the MScaler with each channel processed separately for the most optimum result. Those BNC sockets are designed to either be used individually, or if you hook both up to Chord's MScaler, they can be used with the full 1 million taps from Chord's MScaler. There are also at least one aftermarket dual BNC adapter, which I have not tried, but other people have, if you want to try your own upsampling and have it output through to the dual BNC sockets for something like the TT2 or the Dave. Now for the controls at the front, we of course have a power and a menu button and a set button. And it's also very inconvenient to have to use those to set the different functions. So they're all available on this remote control here. So we can easily select the inputs, USB coax 1 or coax 2. Now, dual BNC will automatically be activated if you select one of the coaxial inputs, your optical. And of course, lastly, we have Bluetooth. If you just want to use this conveniently to connect Bluetooth to some device to listen, that's the kind of thing I use for, say, watching YouTube videos or listening to podcasts, and that can be a very handy function. As I don't actually use the TT2 connected directly to my main computer, I use it through various streamers such as iFi Zen Stream or a Raspberry Pi, or maybe from the Mac Mini, which I have my Roon library on. You also have the volume controls on here, and you can actually change the digital filters, crossfade, and dim the lights as well on it. Now, some of the interesting features that you may not be aware of, the volume control is technically lossless according to Rob Watts, which is something unique for digital volume controls. I tried using, say, Roon's digital volume control to lower the volume on the Shit Audio Yggdrasil slightly because the output was a touch too hot for the Studio 6. And I noticed immediately through the good headphones I have sitting around here that there was a degradation in sound. Now, I've never noticed such a degradation in sound using Chord's TT2. The noise shaping technology he uses is done at such a high resolution that it is technically lossless. And that's one of the advantages of you programming your own FPGA, is if you put enough computing power in there, you can do things at a rate that is going to have no audible effect. One of the other useful features also available on Chord DACs is the crossfade feature. And the crossfade, if you've had some of those old stereo recordings where they put one bunch of instruments in one channel and one bunch of instruments in the other channel and didn't bother to kind of blend it in nicely, that's very handy for kind of making those give more of a kind of even sound. So, some of those old jazz recordings, for example, or some old pop music, that can be very helpful as well. We also have 4 digital filters available. Now, the standard digital filter is the most technically accurate. The second filter has a high frequency cutoff that's into the ultrasonics to cut off some of the high frequency noise on high res recordings, which you may get, say, with a 192 kilohertz recording. What's not too well known amongst audiophiles is that a lot of 192K or better music is really just high frequency noise. My personal recommendation is never to get better than 96 kilohertz music, because basically most noise above the half the sample rate, essentially 48 kilohertz, which is the maximum frequency audio signal that you can have from a 96 kilohertz file, is basically going to be noise. So having a high frequency filter will cut off that high frequency noise, and Rob Watts reckons it makes an improvement. The other 2 filters lower the amount of filtering done by the TT2, and some people have found that it can improve the sound on recordings which are maybe not so high quality. Of course, those 2 filters are respectively one that is a standard filter and another with a high frequency cutoff. They didn't make a huge amount of difference to me, because most of the music a lot of the music I listen to is actually very high quality. But I've seen a couple of reviewers say they preferred the red and orange filters for when they're listening to, say, more kind of common music. Lastly, one of the handy features to have is the mute button, and that's very handy because there are 2 gain levels, which is a first for a Chord product. And if you accidentally plug in-ear monitors in and kind of forget to turn the volume right down, you may want to very quickly hit that mute button in the case where have the volume set to loud, because the volume can go all the way down from very low to actually above 0 dB, so it can actually boost the volume quite a bit, which is very handy if you're using something like Hi-Fi Man Susvaras and you're listening to, say, a classical track which is not recorded with a normal kind of loud compression or a very high volume level. One of the last things I want to mention is that the TT2 comes with a standard wall wart power supply. And now in the audiophilia nervosa kind of thing, people go, what? How could you put a basic switching supply on something that costs, over $4,000? Well, the reason is all the power supply filtering and etc. is done inside the TT2. That basically all the power supply has to do is charge those supercapacitors, and then it doesn't matter what it does. Now, some people I've noticed mainly with the Hugo 2 have complained that when they use the standard Hugo 2 charger, for example, with their Hugo 2, that the sound quality is degraded in their system. What we worked out was actually going on is that the power supply was injecting noise into the ground plane of the power system in their rack, or in their component system, basically. So it was not actually noise going into, say, the Hugo 2, but it was actually going back through the power supply and into their amplifier. So actually what I do with these wall warts is I have a power board which has filtering built in. Now, normally you'd think that would be filtering to stop noise coming from the power supply going into the component, but I also I'm using it kind of in reverse, in that it's filtering any noise generated by the wall warts so that it doesn't go back into the amplifiers and degrade the sound. And this in turn goes back into my Power Plant Premiere, and other components are plugged into the Power Plant Premiere rather than this power board. And the result, amongst some other tweaks I have around, such as having a completely separate socket, completely away from everything else for plugging the Power Plant Premiere in, and putting my computer on noise filtering as well, keeps that noise right down. So it's not something you need to replace with, say, a linear power supply. It's more something that you might get a power board with filtering in there, and plug your wall warts into that and have the power board filter out any noise that they generate. Before we start with the sound impressions, I'd like to thank Headamp for sponsoring this video. Headamp are the makers of the legendary Gilmore series of headphone amps, including the legendary Blue Hawaii, as well as the GSX Mini headphone amp, which I've reviewed previously. They also sell the Chord Hugo TT2, MScaler, Dave, and many of the headphones that you see in this review. As you can see, I got to use the TT2 with a variety of headphones, and in the case of my main power amplifier, the Audio GD Master 10, which I use both with a set of LX speakers, as well as things like Odyssey's LCD-R headphones and the Hi-Fi Man Susvaras. And it's been very interesting to compare it to both the Hugo 2 and the Chord Dave. Like other Chord components, its main focus is being on absolutely clear and as accurate sounding as possible. And in that, compared to the Hugo 2 in comparison sounds a little bit more squashed together and maybe not quite as deep in the sound stage, whereas the TT2 sounds a little bit more open, more deep. You get generally overly more clarity. Now, this clarity people sometimes mistake for brightness because the bass isn't, say, mushed together like you get in maybe some amps which have a slight tuning towards kind of more bass bloom. Likewise, as I've been talking about headphones such as Mezzo's Empyreans, which I like a lot, they do focus on that slightly bloomy sound to make all music sound entertaining. That same thing does happen somewhat in the amplifier world. I mean, people buy tube amps to add a little bit of kind of that euphonic bloom to the sound to make it more enjoyable, as I do. I have the Studio 6 here, which adds a little bit of that in there. I would probably say things like the GSX Mini do ever so slightly too, although it's a generally very kind of clear sounding amp. The TT2 is probably more like the actual GSX amp in that it's designed to be absolutely clean and absolutely perfect in the way it reproduces sound. Like other Chord gear, instrument reproduction is impeccable. It's kind of too good almost in a sense. You do hear very well, very far into the recording, especially if you add the MScaler, which adds even more depth and clarity in there as well. Very subtle nuances in the music do come through very clearly if you have a pair of high-end headphones. It's very easy to distinguish, for example, the sound of, coming out to the Stealth or the LCD5, for example, plugged directly into the TT2, and it's very easy to notice that there's a slight loss of detail if I go in through the Studio 6 as well, or another amp, or the slightly more closed-in sound, maybe if I go through the GSX Mini. The main thing the TT2 offers is that kind of pinpoint clarity and depth. And instead of bringing kind of enjoyment through, say, the euphonic tube sound that I might get through the Studio 6 or a tube amp, it brings through the actual euphonic sound of the instruments themselves. So you do get a experience of kind of feeling the music more, not because it's something induced again by distortion, which a lot of gear does, but induced by the actual subtleties in the music that other DACs might mask because of all the amplification required and filtering required post DAC chip that degrades the sound. Because that doesn't exist in the Chord gear, you get more depth into the music. And if you go into high-end filtering, such as with the MScaler, you get more, again, instead of getting just, more separation between the instruments, you start to hear what's in between the instruments as well. For example, with the Dave and the MScaler especially, you had not just the sound of the instruments being clear, but the reflections of the sound off other instruments and things in the recording space becoming very clear. So you could hear how the instrument was inside its own space. But the thing is that the TT2 became very apparent even on first listen, was extremely clean and clear. But I felt even before I had the Dave in for its second evaluation, that I felt that I wanted something more. There was something a little bit extra missing. And that extra bit missing was when I got the Dave in and hooked up the Dave and MScaler, was that I felt like now I can hear the music. And I really started to feel it more. Especially noticeable with the Dave when I first had it was that it gave me an emotional reaction, like I could feel the music, like it was being injected into me. It's something that you really feel if you've been to a live performance and you can really feel the passion of the players. It was the Dave that really had that, and with the MScaler just added more to it as well. That's something that the TT2 doesn't quite have, although it has it more so than the Hugo 2. It seems to have more clarity than the Hugo 2 and more insight into the music and what the player is expressing. But it always felt even from the start that I wanted that a little bit more. And now that the Dave has gone, my first thought was, what can I sell to buy a Dave? Not the first time I've thought that. And that's the kind of feeling I had with the TT2. I think some of the people I've known who bought a TT2 after knowing that I had one and I recommended it, they now have gone and bought the Chord Dave. They ended up just grading up. Where it was also nice, and I have been enjoying it, much like I used Shit Audio's Yggdrasil, is that with something like the Studio 6, it does provide a nice balance when you want just maybe a touch of euphonic sound in there, much like you have the ability to tone down the filters very slightly using one of the orange or red filters. You can tone it down slightly by plugging in, say, a tube amp as well. So I've been using the Studio 6 to good effect in that regard because it makes everything maybe just a little touch more relaxed. For example, in my Sennheiser HD820 review, I used that maybe with the stock cable straight out of the TT2, but then maybe, I felt like the treble was a little bit edgy, and maybe I wanted to just, go to a warmer Kimber cable and then plug that into the Studio 6, and that was a little bit more kind of mellow. Likewise, when I compared Odyssey's LCD5s to the Hi-Fi-Man Susvaras, when I preferred to optimize that, using the stock, slightly warmer sounding cable, and then the Studio 6 to take a little bit of an edge off that very aggressive mid-range, and that made it felt a little bit more enjoyable for kind of casual music listening, as it is tuned towards studio use and being perfectly accurate for studio mastering. One of the great areas that the TT2 worked exceptionally well was driving high-demand headphones. Now, the nice thing is that the XLR outputs, which can be it doesn't matter if you connect them even to a single-ended input, they can be used to power sensitive speakers. Now, of course, it won't do as good as a T-Toby or a high-end power amp, but I did try it with the direct to the Susvaras after making an adapter cable, which went from dual XLR female connectors to a female 4-pin XLR for the Susvaras. I also used it, of course, in very low gain for the Odyssey's LCDRs with very good effect as well. Now with the Susvaras, it didn't provide quite the magnificent sound that it does straight out of the Master 10. Of course, the Master 10 is a gigantic power amp, so that is no surprise there. But actually it could do very well indeed in powering them quite accurately. Although I did feel like, again, I wanted kind of more body to the sound, maybe a little bit in that regard to the Susvaras, as they tend to be a little bit kind of I don't want to say they're bright and sharp so much, because there was always the HE1000 V2s and say the Arias and that, which are kind of brighter and sharper in that way. But I think they still did a pretty good job directly to the Susvaras. Though, I mean, if you're going to be spending that amount of money on a pair of Susvaras, and I always recommend finding like a better price from a dealer, not the $6,000, which is kind of designed to be bargained down in the Chinese market anyway. And I recommend finding a good power amp to go with them for the most ideal results. But still, I did spend a lot of time listening, and the fact that I could get, say, the LCDRs working out of the back sockets with an adapter cable, and that it would drive safely 2 ohm load, although it's a very sensitive 2 ohm load, without kind of overloading, was really fantastic. The one advantage you do get there is you get the highest level of detail doing that, even if you don't get the very best drive that you can out of such headphones that do have high current requirements, and especially the Susvaras. Maybe one of the negatives of having such a very detailed amp is that it reveals too much about the quality of the music you have. You start, especially with things like now we have things like the headphones like the Stealth, where you really do hear the absolute fine nuances of the recording quality of the music. So for example, I remember listening to Spongle, and you could hear when parts were mixed in and mixed out because the noise level changed, and that was very apparent. This also true with in-ear monitors. You do have this 3.5mm socket, and you can turn the volume very far down and get a almost hiss-free listen, even with extremely sensitive in-ear monitors such as the Campfire Audio models like the Aras and Andromeda and Solaris. Like the Hugo 2, it reveals the pure character of the headphones without any editorialization of the sound. And like what I experienced, this could sometimes be fantastic, and this could sometimes be kind of too much of a good thing. In the end, my feeling about the TT2 is I would probably end up buying the MScaler. If I was to start again with, like one person said they ended up buying a Chord Dave and I think an MScaler instead of buying a nice car. I would probably say buy a Chord Dave, buy an MScaler, and a T-Toby if you're going to want to use, say, speakers or very high demanding headphones, and just be done at that. That's probably one of the only things about the TT2 that is kind of the main negative for me, is that it's not a Dave. And I've heard a Dave, and I know how good it can be. And that was probably the main thing, and why some people I know, including one of my supporters recently, just upgraded to the Dave. And, well, you could see it coming. So if you do see a lot of TT2s on the market, it's probably because people have upgraded to the Dave. The only other thing is, in comparison to R2R ladder DACs, they are like adding a tube amp to your system, where the tube amp adds some even order harmonic euphonics in there. They will give you a kind of constant emotional listen, but maybe at the sacrifice of absolute accuracy in terms of what's possible. So it's kind of a choice of one or the other. You could call the Chord gear kind of far on the extreme of kind of focusing on accuracy and detail, kind of like benchmark audio do in a sense too. And you have things like, as you go across the range, you go across to, say, the amplification gear like the GSX Mini, which is maybe a touch warm, and then maybe a tube amp like the Studio 6, which is a touch warmer still, depending on the tubes you use, and then some other things like Woo Audio, which are very kind of warm and kind of euphonic sounding. The TT2 stays firmly on that focus on accuracy and perfection in there, and especially with the MScaler, it can produce a very emotional reaction to the music if you are not used to such high-end gear. Through speakers, it produces an absolutely accurate soundstage. Instead of kind of, there's no vagueness at all in there. It's very even how everything is. If something is 5 foot away from the microphone, it's 5 foot away. If it's near the microphone, it's near the microphone. There's a very great degree of accuracy in the soundstage, and I noticed that on my LX speakers, in that stuff that would be behind the speakers was behind the speakers, and stuff that was up close was up close. It wasn't like, say, some IFI gear I've used, which may use very short filters that pushes everything up in your face. That very in your face sound, like in a different aspect to, say, using, as I was talking about, using tube amps and other gear to make a more euphonic sound, that can make a very exciting sound, which can be great to listen with. The Chord gear, maybe some people may find that perfect accuracy a little bit lacking in excitement in that regard. So the Hugo TT2 is an interesting contradiction. It has some of the newer, better features, such as the supercapacitor power supply, the fantastic headphone drive, the ability even to drive very sensitive speakers, and a really fantastic headphone output that would drive most headphones pretty reasonably well, although for Susvaras, again, I would either use the back outputs or a power amp. But I wish they had those features inside a Chord Dave, and that would be kind of the ultimate head-fi experience in a sense. Now, if they added also to the Mojo TT2's lossless EQ in there, that would be truly the ultimate device. Unfortunately, of course, Rob Watts has repeatedly said he's not working on a Chord Dave 2 at the moment. So have you owned a TT2 or have you tried one, and what did you think and what did you try it with? Comment below. It's especially helpful for people watching this video, not just to get my opinion and my ideas about the performance of a product, but to see other owners' opinions and ideas as well. So they can, it's a big inexpensive purchase for many people, over $4,000, so they can get an idea of whether it's a suitable product for them to buy. Also, thank you everyone who has been supporting me in making these videos. If you'd like my buying advice, do consider becoming a supporter. Buy me a coffee, in a sense. And not only do you help make these videos, but you can ask my buying advice, ask for suggestions, join our little private community of really great people who will also help you out too. Thank you also for Headamp for sponsoring these videos. If you do decide to buy a TT2 or headphones or other things, consider buying them from Justin at Headamp. He's a great guy. I've known him for a long time, and I agreed to have him as a sponsor because he is someone I know, not just some random company off the internet making true wireless earbuds or something like that. So as always, thanks again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you online.